Deputy President, before I begin, I want to recognise the victim survivors both in this place and across Australia, far too many of whom were taken from their friends and families by this violence, impacted by this violence, and I especially want to acknowledge it today on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. We know in this chamber that violence, family violence, domestic violence, sexual violence is rife in our community. And we know that the pandemic, in many ways for many women, has made it worse. The Minister said in her answers to questions today that the impact of violence didn't end during the pandemic. Absolutely correct, absolutely correct. But what she didn't acknowledge is that for too many women it has worsened. And it has worsened at a time when there are enormous other pressures on women, on their families as well. It has worsened at a time where we need support and action on this issue from the government more than ever. One woman is killed every week by a current or former partner. We know police are called to domestic violence incidents every 2 minutes. Violence is a leading preventable cause of death, illness and disability for women aged 15 to 44. And a 2017 report by White Ribbon found that women in First Nations communities are twice as likely to be victims of violence. As I said, the pandemic has caused significant spikes in family violence, with 2/3 of providers reporting an increase in abuse and especially in controlling behaviours. In October 2020, the Women's Legal Service in Adelaide reported having to turn away 450 calls from women earlier that year during the first waves of lockdowns and quarantine in South Australia. Yet in the context of this, in the context of all that we know, the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government for too long failed to take seriously the task of delivering leadership on women's safety. Now, following the March for Justice, the Prime Minister announced his Women's Cabinet and the Women's Budget with great fanfare. But 6 months later, we're still waiting. We are still waiting for the draft national plan. And organisations are yet to receive the funding promised by this government. In just February last year, it was reported that dozens of trials in the family court were directly impacted by funding shortfalls in legal aid. Refuges have reported having to turn away women, and only 1 in 10 women who want to stay at home have the necessary support to safely do so. The lack of leadership, though, isn't just here from the federal government in Canberra. It exists in my home state of South Australia as well, where we've seen the only domestic violence shelter in Adelaide, the dedicated one for women without children, Catherine House, being subject to a $1.2 million funding cut. Now, senators in this place, I know Senator Wong has a close relationship with Catherine House. I know Senator Farrell does too, Senator Grogan and myself. We have visited this service firsthand many times. We've seen the incredible and important work they do for some of the most courageous women in our state, and they had $1.2 million worth of funding cut. At the federal level and the state level, we hear platitude after platitude. But what we've failed to see delivered, not just this year, but over years and years, indeed decades and decades, is the meaningful commitment of resources with the right level of urgency required to support women, to support families with violence. Victim survivors need so much more support, and I am so proud of Senator McAllister, and I am so proud of our leader, Anthony Albanese, who have just announced that a Labor government will fund 500 new community sector workers to support women and families fleeing family violence, and establish a Commonwealth Family, Domestic and Sexual Violence Commissioner to give victim survivors a strong voice at the highest levels. Domestic, family and sexual violence is an epidemic in our community. For many women and families, it remains an unseen burden which endangers their lives and livelihoods. To make Australia a fairer and safer place, we must drag this horror into the light and deliver real and meaningful action to protect women and families from abuse and violence. Labor is committed to this. In government, we will deliver this. because we heed the calls for urgency and the women and families who cannot wait any longer.